I've noticed, at least in the mental training that I've looked into, a lot of things carry over from like your regular life. You can bring them into sports in terms of like ways to process things mentally. But what have you found to be the inverse of that? Like athletes in particular, what advantages do they have from their sport that they can bring into their everyday lives?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. I think that, there's just so much that you learn through sport that allows you to understand how to deal with life and cope with different difficulties. So, for example, even looking at losing, when you're not winning games, when you're not winning matches, when you're feeling like, this is not going the way I want it to go, how do you respond to that? And through sport, you learn how to kind of persevere, how to have resilience, and basically kind of show yourself that, yes, I'm capable of having these kind of times in my life when I'm disappointed in myself or disappointed in my environment, but nonetheless I can continue to move forward. I think that certainly with, knowing that you can become better at something and practicing and really making yourself aware of how much effort you put into something is what you are going to reap as rewards coming out. I think that sport in and of itself is just, it is the perfect life lesson. It will teach you everything you need to know about life. And it teaches you so much about yourself, as I said earlier. I think that you kind of grow your own identity, and it's easier to understand who you are through sport because of the things that you go through and the things that you kind of struggle with. It teaches you about, teamwork, how to work together with other people. It teaches you about, you could even say right from wrong by, playing by the rules and things like that, and understanding that there are parameters in our life, whether we live in one culture or another. There are parameters that if we stay within those parameters, it's acceptable, but if we kind of wander outside those parameters, it can have consequences. So I think that, above and beyond, I think sport is something that teaches you life lessons and teaches you about yourself.
Yeah. Going to the last point you just made, and especially for like fighting sports, there are rules and allowances in fighting that are absolutely not allowed in everyday life. You can't hit people in the face.
Yeah.
But there are, in many other sports, there are things that are kind of similar, and something that I hear from people all the time is that they have a hard time with aggression. When they're given the permission or when that's a completely appropriate time to be aggressive, they can't access it. And for the most part, my advice, just based on my own experience, has been to find ways in your everyday life where you can be more aggressive, where you're not a dick, basically, like asserting yourself and like kind of, because people in their sports tend to be a heightened version of whoever they are in life. How do you deal with people who might have a hard time with accessing their aggression when it's needed in their sport?
So I think that, and this is one of those conversations that may get a little more philosophical and may require more time than we were able to kind of address, but to put it in the simplest terms in the way that I kind of try to help people deal with that is, I really distinguish between aggressive and assertive. And I tell people, if you're assertive, that's really what you're looking for. Aggressive is, even in sport, aggression usually does not lead to the type of outcomes or the type of performance that you really want it to be.
Right.
So being assertive, being true to your own values and respecting yourself, but also respecting your opponent, even if it means just respecting that they're in the same sport as you. It's that respect that you have for the sport, for yourself, and for the other person. But asserting yourself means that I'm not going to allow you to do anything to me that I don't want you to do. And I'm going to assert myself by trying to make you do things that you're not trying to do. I think that watching your, I think it was your interview, well, not really an interview, but when you went to the fight with Zimmerman on the show, the Travel Channel show that you went to, and he asked you, what are 3 things that you're going to look for in this fight? Like, what are things I want to look for? And you said dominance rather than aggression. And I think the dominance is another way to look at assertiveness. You're asserting yourself over that person. You're asserting yourself over those things.
Right.
And being assertive, again, like I said, it's respecting yourself and the other person. It's not disrespecting the sport, disrespecting them, or anything like that. And I think aggression crosses that line. So when I look at, somebody who's having difficulty, they're accessing that. I think that, if you can distinguish between aggression and assertiveness, it's a lot easier to be assertive than it is to be aggressive. Because a lot of people, it's not a value of theirs. And so they're going against themselves by being aggressive. But if you tell them, well, no, you're being assertive, you don't have to disrespect other people. You don't have to feel like you're being, as you said, a dick. You can actually just say, no, I'm asserting myself for who I am. And so I think being assertive is the way that I would kind of approach that. And then having them understand what assertiveness means, and even writing down some of their values. Because if they don't compromise their values being assertive, they're going to love themselves and love what they're doing.
How do you, I've found in my own process that I find that 9 times out of 10 when I'm trying to train something mentally that I kind of don't know how to do, I find something in my everyday life that's similar enough that I'm like, okay, I do have that skill. So, for example, if you're over aroused and you're trying to calm yourself, most people are able to fall asleep. And so there's this skill that you've had most of your life where you can kind of bring yourself into a more calming state. But there are times where I have this kind of knee-jerk reaction to I don't know how to do that. Like I'll come up against a mental hurdle and I just feel like I have absolutely no idea how to tackle it without stopping and thinking, what might this be similar to in my regular life that I actually do know how to do that? So how can people who don't have access to like a regular mentor or someone who's helping them in mental training, how do you teach people patterns of recognition to even just be mentally aware of their states of mind, and that emotions are not things that happen to us, they're things that we have control over?
Yeah, I think awareness is definitely what we're looking at there, and understanding what the different mental skills are, so if you go through, imagery, self-talk, arousal regulation, like you said, kind of psyching yourself up or relaxing yourself, focus and attention, goal setting, confidence, motivation, awareness, and I think I'm missing a couple because I don't have them in front of me. But I think that, even awareness of those skills and knowing what they are, that allows you at least the ability to access what it is that you're talking about. And then kind of looking at your own life, like you said, you look at any part of your life and say, yeah, I know what imagery is. I can imagine myself doing dishes right now. And it's not exciting to do dishes, but I can imagine myself doing it. And so it's kind of like, okay, so I can do the same thing for anything that I'm doing. I can imagine my house where I grew up. I can imagine walking my dog. I can imagine doing all these different things. And it's like, well, right, but if I put into practice this imagery, which I can use memories for, I can actually start putting myself into training mentally for those things. The second part of that I would say you need to do after just being aware and knowing what these skills are is kind of looking at the skills and saying, okay, well, like anything, the more I practice it, the better it will become. And so letting yourself know that, okay, I have to give my time and put in my time to do these things. And like anything as well, you can start way too difficult tasks and feel like a failure because it's not working, or you can start your tasks that are more simple, and then that'll be a lot easier. As far as how our emotions can be regulated by the way we're thinking or the way we're behaving, if you think of it like a circle, so the top of the circle is going to be kind of your behaviors. So it's like, this is what I do. And then from there, what I do will allow me to think about whatever it is that I'm putting my task, my efforts towards and everything. So this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm thinking, and that will lead to ultimately over here kind of how I'm feeling about it. So as an example of that, a lot of people get it backwards, where they tell themselves, as soon as I feel confident, then I'm going to go do all these things, right? but that's backwards, because you're going to wait too long, and a lot of people can act confidently without being confident, and we mistake that with our perception that just because they're acting a certain way, they must feel a certain way. So instead, we reverse it. We tell ourselves, well, I'm going to start behaving this way and doing these things in order to gain confidence. And so it's kind of the behavior kind of comes first, and then the emotion comes behind it. You could say the same thing as far as the way we think about things. If I'm about to go into a fight and I'm telling myself, well, I'm really concerned about this, I've never fought this person, I'm feeling kind of anxious, I'm noticing my heart rate, I'm focusing on all these things, and then like, well, what if I lose? I practiced so hard and trained so hard just for this fight. Well, if I'm telling myself all of those things, I'm certainly not going to feel confident. I'm going to feel anxious, and I'm going to feel like I'm not myself. I'm going to feel maybe nauseous and sick. Whereas if I tell myself stuff like, well, I've been in this situation before, I know I'm going to continue to train regardless of the outcome of this fight. I know that I'm prepared for this. I've done everything I can. You have to tell yourself stuff you believe, though. You can't tell yourself, I know I'm going to dominate and win this, and it's going to be there's nobody standing in front of me. Like, if you tell yourself stuff that you don't believe, it doesn't help at all. And so it's kind of, again, the behavior or the thought that will lead to the emotion rather than it being any other way.
So I'm a big fan of the Dan Gable approach to more is more. Is there such a thing in mental training? Is it just that more is more in mental training, and it's, you know, the more you do, the better it is? Or is there such a thing of kind of overdoing it, and you need to kind of have a mediated program of mental training?
I think that with more is more, I think as long as it's balanced, I think that that's accurate. I think if it's imbalanced, I don't think that it's going to help much. It would be equivalent to me saying, you know, more is more, so if you run and run and run and run more, you're going to be a better fighter. And you're like, well, what about hitting the bag? What about practicing the clinch? What about, you know, working on my breathing? And I'm like, well, no, you just want to run more. And you're like, well, that's not really accurate. That's not going to help. And so it's the balance of it. So if you're balancing all of these mental skills, if you're only focused on imagery, well, then you're going to be pretty confused when your thoughts are doing things in a fight that you're not used to your thoughts doing. If you only work on your thoughts and your kind of self-talk, well, then you're not going to be able to see things that might be coming because you're not using your imagery. And so it's kind of a balanced approach to kind of looking at these different skills and saying, okay, I need to kind of have all of these skills, and the more I practice them, the better they will become. Certainly in our lives, different times in our lives, different aspects and different things will take priority. So I think that as a fighter develops, or as any athlete develops, different skills are going to be more important at different times.
Right.
And so as long as you can be aware of that, and as long as your awareness allows you to say, I need to have balance and I can work on these different things at different times, then I would agree more is more.
Yeah. I get people sending me questions, and this is definitely something I recognize in myself as well, which is that you kind of have a tendency to let mental training go by the wayside when everything's good. And then when things go bad, like you lose a fight, like I never get people who are like, I just won my fight, what should I do for mental training? They're always like, I just lost my fight and felt like I wasn't even in the ring, and what do I do, and all these things. And for myself, even though I'm very aware of how much mental training has given me and how much farther I have to go with it, I totally get lazy in terms of like not keeping up with it when things seem to be going pretty well because I feel good. So what is your advice for what a good regimen looks like? You know, like people can look up how to do a bench press on the internet, but having an actual weight training regimen is an entirely different thing.
Right. So like you said, you can apply any of these things to your life directly. So even if it feels difficult to apply it to your sport, you can still apply it to part of your life and learn about yourself and learn about how the technique or the skill is used. As far as a regimen, I would just say, if you can try and figure out, like you do with training, if you have a particular time of day that you like to train, if you have, you know, certain things that you like to do at different times. So, for example, we know that, you know, using bigger muscle groups before using smaller muscle groups when you do strength training. So, for example, I wouldn't do my tricep training before I do my chest training. I would do chest and then tricep. Well, we know that there are certain things that if you do them in a particular order, they tend to be more effective. I would hesitate to say that there are certain things that you can do mentally that should be done before other things, because I think everybody's different. And mental skills aren't exactly like muscles where you can fatigue one and that will affect another. But I do think that, the awareness is definitely where a lot of stuff starts. Is awareness of those things. And then after you move through awareness, focus and attention, because if you can't focus and pay attention to your particular skill for very long, it's not going to be effective because you have to give it the time. Similarly, I think that when you look at training in a regimen, if somebody says, yeah, I need you to run for 5 minutes every day, well, unless you're doing wind sprints, that's not going to do much for you. And even doing wind sprints for 5 minutes is not going to do a lot unless you can kind of recover and go again and stuff like that. So if you said, well, I want you to practice awareness or focus for 5 minutes, well, it's going to do something. It's just not going to do a lot. And so if you can put in the regiment of saying, okay, well, I'm going to focus on a mental skill and I'm going to practice it for 20 minutes every single day, and it doesn't have to be the same skill, but as long as I'm practicing for a minimum of 20 minutes, I'm really going to reap the greatest benefits from that. As far as, focusing more on these things when you're not performing well, I think that when we're not performing well, it makes us kind of question ourselves and question who we are and question why we're not experiencing things the way we want to or why we're not successful. And that allows us to kind of reflect and say, what is it that I can do better? Whereas when we're doing very well and we're winning, well, we don't think about those things so much because we think, yeah, I'm in my element. I'm doing what I need to do. And so it is hard to tell yourself that I need to focus on these things regardless of the outcome of the different sports or whatever venues I'm performing in. But if you look at kind of making yourself more yourself, if you keep telling yourself that, whether it's strength training, cardio training, mental training, whatever it is, if you're telling yourself I'm making myself a better me, it's easier to kind of say that that's why I'm doing these things. Because it's easy when you keep winning and stuff, it's easy to say I don't need to do any more because I'm already where I want to be. But if I want to be a better self, then I know that, well, I need to continue to put in the effort.
What are, I know that in mental training it's really important to set both short-term and long-term and like medium-term goals in order to, track your progress. But actually in mental training, for mental training, what are some examples of short-term versus long-term goals for your mind, like that you would pace for yourself?
That's a very good question. I think, to make it easier, do you want to pick one of the mental skills and then I'll go through that one?
Yeah, do it.
Well, I was asking you if you wanted to pick.
I think that the most common one that people struggle with is imagery.
Okay, so if I think of imagery and I want to have a long-term goal for imagery, maybe my imagery goal is I want to be able to imagine an entire fight without interruption. And so I want to be able to, in my mind, go through an entire fight and kind of analyze it and go through it, but have it in real time. Research has shown the most effective kind of imagery training is training that takes as long as the actual event will take. So when I was working with a long distance runner, he said he was working on his mile run, and I said, okay, why don't we go ahead and do that? So go ahead and close your eyes and start working on your run. And he closed his eyes, and probably about 20 seconds later, he goes, okay, got it.
It's a fast mile.
Well, yeah, that's a very, very fast and efficient mile. Now, given when you're running, it's difficult to kind of have that imagery because really the running, your form is going to stay the same the entire time. But the way you feel, like when your lungs start burning and they're on fire and your legs start feeling like they're a little bit more like lead, and when you kind of feel like, I'm watching other people gain on me, or I'm trying to not lose the pack, whatever it is that's in your head, that's the part of the imagery that you're going to have to focus on most, because the actual mechanics of running, runners won't have to worry about that. So a long-term goal for imagery might be, I want to be able to imagine myself in that run for every single lap if you're doing it on a track, or for the course, whatever the course may be. I want to see the entire thing. I want to go at time, the actual time it would take, and I want to have all of those other components of imagery, how I feel, what I see, what I hear, all of the other elements, the senses, have to be in that. So that might be a long-term goal, is to be able to do that entire thing. Short-term goals might be, well, I want to be able to use the imagery of me running, but I want to also kind of put into myself the feeling of the lungs burning.
Right.
And so just those two things are the things I want attached. And then the long-term goal is putting it all together. So short-term goal would be, I want to kind of accept that there are these different elements and senses I have to have associated to my imagery, and then long-term has to be that. Another long-term goal for imagery is being able to change your imagery. I call it mental editing, where you basically go back to a memory where something happened that you did not want to happen. So for example, a really poor performance in a fight where you're like, I totally should have seen that knee coming, and I did not. I didn't protect myself at all. And it's kind of taking that memory and running the memory like you're watching a video, pausing it when you need to pause it to see where it went wrong, and then kind of filling in that gap with your own kind of imagery of how it should have gone. And when you really associate that and make it feel like a memory, that could be another long-term goal, is being able to edit your memories that way. And short-term would just be able to kind of pause and manipulate it.
In terms of like people's progress along that line, I came to mental training, I wouldn't say late. I think that I started happily when I did. It's that thing where like if you start today, a year from now, you'll be really happy you started today. But I had a lot of time without mental training, and where I actually resisted it because, one, it was hard, and two, I kind of had a hard time with the vocabulary and all these things. But when I think back in terms of my own training from the beginning to now, as a beginner in any sport or in any skill, you have a lot of progress at the beginning, because going from zero to something is a lot, and then you kind of slow down. And I feel like when I first started in Muay Thai, it was like 90% physical, and should have been more than 10% mental, but I was pretty much like 10% mental. But as I've progressed, and now that I have so many fights, and I'm beyond the intermediate level of my sport, I feel like now it's like 98% mental and like 2% physical, because I'm not learning new skills. I'm learning how to access those skills under different pressure. So what are the ways that people in their programs progress? Like, do you use different skills as a beginner, both in the sport and with mental training, versus like Olympic level athletes who are masters of their sport and have been in it for like 10 years?
Well, I think, working with Olympians, certainly they're very aware of these skills. Even if they don't have names for them, even if they haven't worked with a mental skills coach or a sports psychologist, they're very aware of all of these things because of how much they've dedicated to their sport. And then working with, younger athletes, especially if you look at age, like developmentally, a lot of them just can't comprehend what you're talking about. And so, a lot of it is just playing games and getting them to understand what this stuff is. And so again, games like sports, you get to learn a lot about life, but if you look at an actual athlete, as long as they're cognitively available to kind of manipulate these things and understand these things, then it's basically training like you would with, we'll take, your sport again. We'll take, fighters. So having the right punch doesn't mean that you just punch harder or faster. It means you have the right form. And so similar to mental skills, you want to have the right form in the way that you're doing things. So like I said, telling yourself a bunch of stuff that sounds fantastic for motivation, but you don't believe any of it, doesn't help anything. And so it's kind of like, okay, let's start with the awareness. What are you telling yourself? You have to be at least aware of that. Once you're aware of that, we have to say, okay, now we have to come up with certain things you can tell yourself that you believe. Now, that's all well and good, but it'll change over time. It won't always be the same. And similarly with, using imagery, it's like, okay, be aware of imagery. Then we need to kind of figure out a way to kind of have you better understand how imagery will work for you. Focus and attention, same thing. It's like focus and attention is a skill. It's something that we take for granted if we're good at it. And if we're not good at it, we just think I have ADD. Well, that's not necessarily true. What it means is I just have to practice this skill and make it better. So I think that looking at the basics of it, it's kind of looking at, the awareness, and then how do I manipulate it? How do I make it personal? Once you make it personal, I think you're to the third level. After you've made it personal, then it's kind of making it, okay, now how do I refine it so that it's going to be something that is making me better and better? So it's personal to me, and now I'm able to kind of manipulate it and make it better. And then it's kind of the tweaking it would be probably about the fifth level, where you're tweaking it to kind of particular things that are happening in your sport or in your life at this particular time. That kind of tweak and that kind of balance that you can find with the different ones, I think that would be level 5, which would be the highest level you could get. I do know, working with Olympians, that, you know, all of them tell me when you reach that level, they said the only difference between you and any other athlete is going to be what you do up here. And everyone has told me that. They said, you know, you talent-wise, it's a wash. Everybody's extremely talented. Skill-wise, it's a wash. Everybody's extremely skillful. Athletic-wise, everybody's extremely athletic. I mean, look, you're looking at the peak of the peak. So they're like, so what's going to separate you? And the only separation is going to be what you're doing upstairs.
Yeah. How do people know where to start or how much to start with? I've talked to a number of people. There was one girl who was injured, and she was going to go into surgery, so she knew that she was going to be out of sport for probably a year, but she hadn't had the surgery yet, so she was still kind of like adjusting in her training, but it was going to be like a clean cut, you're not going to be training for a year. And I told her, you need to get good at your mental training now before your surgery so that you're good at it when you need it. So how do people prepare themselves for that? Because I have this very unique situation where my feedback loop is really frequent because I fight like 5 times a month. But most people don't have that. So they're really like testing themselves, you know, after work 3 times a week, or they have a fight like 2 times a year or something like that. So how do people figure out that kind of anticipatory training?
So again, you have to personalize it for yourself. So for you, because of your loop being so short, you're able to kind of put this stuff together where it's like, okay, I need to implement this and I need to start associating it now, right? For people who have a longer timeline, whether it's an injury or you just don't fight as often, well, just implement that into your training and make sure that you're doing it in a way that is effective for you. So instead of, what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to kind of manipulate your mental training and then see how it affects the fight within a couple days. These other kind of situations, you're going to have to manipulate your mental training and then see how it affects your training. And so you're going to have to apply it to the training in order to have any sort of a measurement of whether or not it's doing anything. If you're injured and you can't train, well, then the best things you can do for yourself is start focusing on the recovery. And you can use all of these skills for the recovery. You can also, they did a study where they had a bunch of athletes, and for simplicity, we can make it whatever it is. So let's say, again, fighters. So let's say they had a bunch of fighters. They were all injured in the same way, let's say an elbow injury. And so it was hard for them to, you know, jab or punch or do anything with their arm. Well, they took half of them and put them in a control group, and then the other half they had in an imagery group. So the control group, they got the medical attention, they got the attention from their loved ones, they got all of the other things that they would normally get to kind of recover. And then the group who they were testing did everything the same, except they also used mental skills. The 2 mental skills they asked them to do is they said, number 1, we want you to imagine you're recovering. So imagine your elbow getting better. Imagine the tendons and the muscles and everything else getting back to exactly the way they're supposed to be. The second part of the imagery is they said, we want you to imagine that you're still training. Imagine you're hitting the bag. Imagine you're getting into the, you know, into throws and getting into different things like that, clinching. And they said, okay, so imagine those 2 things, and we had them practice those for at least 20 minutes in their recovery as they went. Well, 2 things were very relevant in the outcome. 1, the people who were in the control group, they did pretty well coming back. But the group that were in the mental skills training, the imagery group, they recovered faster from their injury, so they healed faster. And then 2, when they came back to training, it was as if they had lost almost no time at all. Whereas the control group came back and they had to start practicing these things again.
Right.
Muscle memory is something where if you imagine yourself doing it, your muscles will actually fire. They don't fire all of the fibers, so you don't have movement. but the actual muscles will fire in the sequence that you want them to fire in order to remember how to do these things. And so I think that looking at somebody who's saying, well, I can't train for a year, well, start using the imagery to imagine yourself doing the things you're doing right now, and imagine you're healing in the way that you want to heal. So again, it's applying the imagery in the best way that's going to fit. So for you, it fits best if you can apply it to your fight and then put it into context for the next fight right away,
right,
because you fight so frequently. For somebody who fights infrequently, it's like, well, I want to apply it to my training and see how it works with my training. For somebody who's in injury or who can't fight for a particular period of time, it's how do I apply it to my injury and then make it go forward and then pretend like I'm still practicing and training in my head. So that's how I would say you need to apply it to yourself and your situation, and that's the way it's going to be most effective.
There's a parable that I like that I've heard about this guy who goes to a guru, and he's like, if I, put myself to it and dedicate myself, how many years is it going to take me to reach enlightenment? And the guru's like, 10 years. And the guy's like, oh man, well what if I work really, really hard and like really push myself? And the guru says, 20 years. And he's like, no, if I really, really push hard and work and like do it every day. And he's like 30 years. He just keeps adding it because it's not about that tension. And I feel like in my own experience, because I'm such a hard worker, like I can physically grind out anything, but that's not how mentality works. Like you don't want to mentally grind. And I have to keep pulling myself back. Like the way I became aware of my own self-talk was by writing it down. And then being like, would you ever say that to someone else? Like, yeah. Not unless I really hated them. So is actually just writing down like several times a day or like throughout your training, or what are the actual techniques that people can become more aware of things that they're doing?
So especially again with the self-talk, I think that writing things down is fantastic. I would recommend writing things down with a couple different kind of tools. One tool is to have an alarm go off, and whenever that alarm goes off, you write down what you were thinking. Regardless of what's going on, you need to stop and write it down. So obviously in training, you have to let anybody else know that that's going to happen if you're sparring or something. But it could be highly beneficial while you're sparring to know what's going on in your head. If you're wearing gloves and you can't write, then you need to tell somebody to write it down for you.
Right.
Another thing that you can do is you can have, instead of the alarm going off kind of throughout your training, is you can have your alarm go off throughout the day. So regardless of what you're doing, cooking pancakes, you can be like, oh wait, okay, this is what I'm thinking right now. And a lot of it will be stuff that you won't use, but it still makes you more aware, and it still kind of picks that up for yourself. If you can do it while training, it makes you highly aware of what you're doing. There's this wonderful story of a sports psychologist who was working with a woman in the women's PGA, and he told this kind of athlete, you have a really horrible self-talk, and she was like, no, I don't. I hardly ever think bad stuff, and he goes, no, you really do. And so they argued back and forth, and finally he said, okay, let's do this. Take 100 paper clips and put them in your left pocket, and every time you have a negative thought, I need you to move it to the right pocket. And she goes, well, okay. And he goes, no, now pay attention to this, though, because what I need you to do is the more aware of these things you are, the more we can have an effect on them. So when you have a negative thought and you become aware of it, I need you to start really doing this. And she goes, yeah, okay. And so she figured by the end of 18 holes, she'd maybe have like 10 that had moved to the right pocket. It was I think she was on the third hole when all 100 were over in the right pocket.
Jesus.
And you think about this, well, think about it, because like, let's say she tees off and it's not going exactly where she wants it to go, and she goes, I probably could have hit that better. So then she takes a paper clip. Well, then she's looking at the paper clip and she goes, oh no, I'm having negative self-talk. Well, that's another negative self-talk thought. That's 2 in a row. There's another negative self-talk thing. And so you actually have to stop yourself, because it's such a domino effect. It just goes so quickly. As soon as you're having these negative thoughts, that they pile up on each other, and being able to stop it is another skill. And so I think that the awareness of these skills and the awareness of how they affect you, it's profound once you really kind of understand how it's working. Similarly with imagery, when we have these negative images, like a gymnast who crashes, which means she's doing something that most humans can't do, and then she actually hurts herself because she hits the beam or doesn't quite catch the bar, or doesn't land without tweaking ankle or something like that. Well, her memory of that is definitely there, and it's the body's self-preservation that's telling itself, remember this, because you don't want to hurt yourself again.
Right.
Well, then you have this image in your head, stuck in your head, going that way, and every time you go back to that event, it's right there in front of you. And so it's kind of, how do I stop this image? How do I make it better? How do I tweak it so that I'm doing what I want it to? And what's interesting is they could have done this same skill thousands of times without ever falling. But it's only the time they fell that they remember, oh, that image is stuck in my head. And then, of course, with the image comes the fear and everything else that's going with it, and then the self-talk, like, what if that happens again? And so it's kind of the awareness, and then being able to kind of say, okay, how do I tweak and change these things so that it's working for me rather than against me?
Yeah. People are kind of, myself included, we tend to, like, protect our weaknesses. We defend them, and then we get to keep them. So I feel like I kind of have this, like, hands up in the air, like, I'm just a negative person. Like, I tend to have a lot of negative thoughts. I'm just naturally that way. And through my own, thinking and processing, I've come to kind of dismiss this idea of the way you naturally are. There's something about our culture where we think that nature is this really pure, true thing, but I've come to realize that the thoughts I consider to be natural are no less real than the thoughts I should be replacing them with. And so it's more like, it's not I'm just a negative person and this is just who I am, but more like I'm right-handed, so I am going to reach for things with my right hand more often, but that doesn't mean I can't train my left hand and use my left hand and, like, reroute those pathways to become a little bit more ambidextrous. So, like, I may never be a super positive person who thinks a positive thing first, but, like, retraining those pathways is something that I've seen proof that I can do. So in terms of people kind of defending their own weaknesses or being like, that's not, I don't know why I feel this way, or this kind of stuff, how do you get people to take ownership of controlling their own thoughts, emotions, and paths like that?
I really love how you put that, because that's a very wonderful way to kind of explain it, where I'm right-handed. That doesn't mean I can't use my left hand. And it doesn't mean that I won't automatically reach for something with my right hand if given the choice. It'll just happen. Because I think that some people have the perception that if I work on self-talk enough, I'll only have good thoughts.
Yeah. Nope.
And that's just not realistic.
I've worked hard.
Yeah. So it's like I said in the beginning with what sports psychology is, it's how we respond to our environment, how we respond to ourselves. You will never get rid of your negative self-talk. You'll never get rid of anxiety. You're always going to have anxiety. You'll never get rid of fear. You will always have fear. It's how you respond to the thoughts, the emotions, the behaviors, the environment. How you respond to it is what you're training. You're not training that it'll just go away.
Right. So this is kind of a longish question, because I'm giving an example. But I have a personal problem with avoidance, which is that I love to just not deal with the things that are going to be causing repeated problems for myself because it's uncomfortable and I don't like facing it and I'd rather just put it to the side. But Ronda Rousey fought today after a year off from her first loss, and it was devastating, and she handled her first loss really badly. She didn't go to the press conference afterwards and then basically became a hermit in the woods for like a year to train for her next fight. And she decided she didn't want to do any of the media stuff because that had been, she'd like burned herself out. And so these things make sense. Like, if you're doing these extra things that are putting a mental tax on you, it makes sense to opt out of the like traveling around and promoting the show. But then her office is an octagon with thousands of people watching and millions of people watching on TV. So you can't completely stay outside of what the context of what you're going to be doing is. So there are positive avoidances, like I know not to talk to Master K before a fight, but I'll call him after. Like, that seems okay. But then there's very negative avoidance where you're going to be hitting the same wall over and over again because you refuse to acknowledge that it's there. Like, I'm going to hide in the woods for a year and then come back to a stage with millions of people. So how do you see the division between positive and negative avoidance, or if there's a different word that's positive for avoidance, because avoidance sounds very negative. But where is the line between those two? Because there are things that people should avoid, like if you have a coach who makes you feel bad about yourself, don't talk to that guy. But at the same time, if you can't have someone ask you how you feel before a fight, you can't just avoid that completely.
So I think, it's going to be in context of the person, in context of where they are in their development, in context of where they are in their environment. All of those things are going to play a major role. But as far as avoidance, and I agree, avoidance has a negative connotation. But I think if we were to put it in context of a phobia is avoidance of something because of a irrational fear. So it's not rational, like, we're in a barn where we know that there are black widows, and I pick up a rake and a spider crawls across my hand and I flip it away and I freak out. Well, that's self-preservation. That's not a phobia at all. The phobia comes with, there's a daddy long leg that's 20 feet away walking away from me, and I jump up on a desk and throw my shoes at it and try and freak out in that way. Well, that's avoidance, because they've been avoiding spiders so much that you could ask them, hey, did you see the new Spider-Man? And they kind of freak out a little bit. It's like, what just happened? It's like, well, you said the word. And it's, well, said what? Spider? And they're freaking out because they avoid so much of it that now it's become this mountain of a fear. Whereas if you hadn't avoided it, it wouldn't be that mountain. So they can't watch movies like they'd be watching, Harry Potter with those giant spiders, and they would just, flip out and leave the theater. And it's like, okay, well, it's not working for you. This is affecting your life in a way that's not allowing you to live your life the way you want to live your life. That's the type of avoidance where I'd say that's a big problem. Whether it's making you avoid certain things within your sport, whether it's making you avoid things within your life, that avoidance is the thing that's going to cause the biggest issue.
Right.
So if we're looking at whether it's positive or negative, if it's something that is affecting your training or affecting the way that you do things in a negative way, even if that negative thing just means that I don't do those things anymore and it's causing me to find ways to work around certain things, that's a negative thing. If you work into them where it's like, well, no, I'm avoiding those things, but it doesn't affect my life, it doesn't affect my training, it actually makes me feel better about myself, well, that's probably the thing, right?
Yeah, so let me just re-ask in a more concise way so that we can piece it together. But just in terms of things that you can avoid in the short term versus things that you can't avoid forever and need to address eventually.
So I think that it's, well, when you're not avoiding, I guess, again, in terms of making it functional, we have what's called flooding, which is when whatever you're avoiding, you just completely immerse yourself in it to try and face the fear. And a lot of times that can be effective, but no one really volunteers. So
put the spiders all over
me. So kind of, it's called graded exposure. So for example, the Ronda Rousey thing that you talked about with her kind of interacting with the media, instead of doing 16 interviews a week, maybe she would say, okay, well, I'm going to have to do this anyway, so maybe I'll do one a day, or maybe I'll do one every other day, or even one a week, because that's gradually exposing yourself to the thing that you're avoiding, and that can really make it easier for you to handle over time.
So that's...
Does that answer it?
Yeah, and the practical application in sports, obviously, in my sport, is getting hit. I'll have people write to me and they're like, I have a really hard time getting hit in the face. And I'm like, yeah. You just keep getting hit in the face and it kind of gets better after a while, but nobody likes getting hit in the face.
Right. Right. So the example of flooding would be getting hit in the face for an hour.
Totally.
Right, and it's like, well, that's probably not a good idea. But the gradual exposure would be like, okay, so maybe what you want to do is you want to spar, and you're going to, basically say, yes, we're going to, hit in the face, but we're going to minimize it this session. And then next session we'll say, okay, we can do it more, and it's kind of giving yourself that exposure to allow yourself to kind of feel comfortable with it.
Yeah.
You're not going to like it. You never like it. It's not like, well, now I just like getting hit in the face. It just makes it so that it's more tolerable. It's more something that you're willing to accept.
Yeah. That's something I tell people when they write to me and they're very upset because they've lost. And I'm like, you know, I've done it before, so I'm kind of okay at it now. When you've only lost like 1 or 2 times, it's really difficult because you just don't really have experience with it. But when you get up in the 40s, you're like, yeah, no, you know, shit happens. It's all right.
Well, and I think another thing looking at as far as losing and stuff is, it's so much of your self-worth and your value is placed upon what it is you're doing. And you know, if you look at the outcome, you're always going to judge yourself only on the outcome. Where if you look at the process and you look at, this is what I'm trying to do, then you can be completely satisfied with what you're doing. As long as you tell yourself, you know, okay, so did I put in the effort? And do I feel like I improved? Yeah. If those two things exist, you can be completely satisfied with a loss. But if you're like, well, I'm only looking at the outcome, well, you don't even know if you put in effort. You don't know if you progressed. All you know is that you lost. Well, that doesn't do anything for you.
Yeah.
And so I think that looking at losses and looking at things like that, it's like, okay, well, it's inevitable. Like, you're going to lose. And even if you don't lose, then you're probably not really challenging yourself much. Like, guess what? I'm 72-0 playing basketball against 4-year-olds. And it's like, wow, you should be very proud of yourself, you know?
That's something that I tell people after these losses is that everything you did leading up to that fight, you get to keep. Like, all of that work you put in, you get to keep. And it's, they have this whole, like, it was all for nothing because I didn't perform it in America, 6 minutes. Because you only get 3 rounds. I'm like, so those 6 minutes didn't work out for you. But it's kind of, to me, what I've come to realize with my own mentality is that it's like you work and work and you get your paycheck and it's like a direct deposit in your bank. And then you go to the fight and you forgot your debit card, you can't access it. It doesn't mean you lost all your money, you just didn't access it. So now you need to figure out your PIN, or, like, you know, people get money metaphors. So maybe. Maybe that works. I don't know. So another question was how, this is kind of what we've been covering already, but maybe you can give like 3 concrete examples for people to start out. But how do you identify and address self-limiting beliefs, whether they're in the sport or out of the sport?
Yeah, I think again, because the awareness part can be so difficult, I think that, again, that alarm, setting an alarm so that it goes off while you're training, and then just writing down or saying out loud whatever's in your head, and doing that several times is a concrete way to find out what's going on in your head for the self-limiting stuff. Another one to look at is to look at yourself and kind of ask, am I comparing myself to other people? And if I'm comparing myself to other people, am I doing it in a way that's valid? Am I doing it in a way that is accurate? And like I said, people can look very confident and not feel confident at all. So if you're looking at other people and you're like, well, I'm not confident because I can see other people are confident. Well, you can see what you observe. You don't know their emotion, you know? And so I think that another way for self-limiting is this confidence or lack of confidence. And I think that if you're judging yourself off of your own perceptions of what other people are looking like, well, then it's only yourself you're judging yourself against. Your perception of other people is purely your own. You own that. That is not somebody else telling you their perception of themselves. And so if you're making those comparisons and you feel like it's a loss of confidence because of how you compare yourself to other people, ask yourself, well, is it my perception, or are they actually telling me? And if they're actually telling me, are they being honest? And so I think that those are 2 ways that you can kind of really work on the kind of self-limiting stuff. Another self-limiting thing is if you continuously do the same thing over and over and you're seeing, you know, the same results, but you're expecting them to be different, well, that's the definition of insanity, is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. So a self-limiting thing is sometimes we're not even aware we're doing that. We just keep doing the same thing over and over and expect ourselves to get better. And if it's not working, you need to change something. So a self-limitation is when we're stuck in our own routine and we need to figure out something to do that'll be different. So I hope those are 3 pretty good concrete examples.
So my last question is actually a little bit just personal to you, which is that you're a dad now. So in terms of like being able to use your profession and things that you've learned and all of this information sports psychology is actually fairly new still, but you can raise your son, and crossing my fingers that you also have a daughter, and I'm just warning you in advance, shit's going to be real different between your son and your daughter, and the way they see themselves in the world. How do you, in like watching Ender become like a little person, how do you kind of steer him and how he's going to be able to understand himself, and how much of it is like, we'll just see how it works out? Like, how do you deal with that as a father and an academic?
So I think that, to be completely honest, I think that almost 90% of it is, let's see how things go. Because I'm very aware of how much I don't control. And I'm very comfortable knowing that I don't control practically anything, even myself. So I would say that I'm a pretty well-functioning, healthy adult, and I would say I control 99% of my thoughts. I don't even own all of those. 99% of the time I'm in control and I have the thoughts I want to have, but there are the thoughts I don't want to have that pop into my head. There are things people can say, don't think of pink elephants, and that's going to pop in my head.
Right.
But I can control where my thoughts go from there. Similarly, my own behaviors, I think I control probably 95% of those. I think anyone who says they control 100% of their behaviors, they don't know what startle response is.
Right.
So, and then I'd say about my emotions, I'd say I'm probably up there like at 90%, where it's like I can really control how I'm feeling because of what I think and what I do. But those are in the best conditions. So that's when everything is kind of working pretty well. So when Ender's having a meltdown and he's entering into the terrible twos, I think that I really kind of think to myself, well, okay, maybe he's trying to figure this out himself. He's got emotions that he doesn't understand. He doesn't know what to do. He knows he can manipulate the environment a little bit by doing some of these things, but there's nothing I can do about it. It's going to be him learning how to process these things himself. And I can console him. I can ignore him. I can, try and redirect him. I can do everything in my power to try and change these things, but he's still himself. So regardless of how much information or how much I help him, he's still himself, and he will learn more about himself and be a better person if he is allowed to do those things. And, just knowing that I can tell him something 50,000 times, and then when he's 6 years old and he's hanging out at a friend's house and his friend's dad says the same thing I've been saying 60,000 times, he's going to come home and he's going to be like, Roger's dad's so smart, he just said this. And it'll be something that I'm like, oh, that's nice. But the important part is that he got it. It's not important that it came from me. It's important that, okay, he's got this. You know? So I think that, as far as let's see how things go, I'd say a vast majority of the time it's let's see how things go. Like, I don't think that it's healthy to think you can control anything except parts of yourself. So I think that's where we're at. As far as, having a little girl, Kenzie and I have had conversations about what will be different and how will we do these things differently and what will be fair, because there are some things that won't be fair. And we're going to have to figure out, is that for us, for our benefit, or is it for the benefit of our children? And are we willing to say it's unfair, but we're going to do it anyway, or are we unwilling to do that? And I think that any which way we do it is going to be wrong in some ways and right in some ways. We'll just have to see how it plays out.
Yeah. I've been astonished because I'm, being the girl amidst the boys growing up, and I kind of rejected girls for a really, really long time because I just wanted to be part of, like, the boy pack, and I just didn't get girls, like they're like aliens or something. That as I've gotten older, I've become more and more invested in what that particular female identity is rather than shunning it, and just being absolutely astounded at the patterns in how women see themselves given culture compared to men. Like, there are so many men who are confident in, like, I'm pretty awesome. And then women who actually are really awesome, have a really hard time in training because they don't want to be impolite in sparring. And I'm like, you're hitting someone in the face. Like, nobody's like, I love that sparring partner, she's real polite. Like, it's very strange to me. And it's, I see it in myself. I see the same struggles of, like, not wanting to take up space or, like, impose yourself. and then you just see men who are like man spreading all over the place. They just don't care, and it's fascinating that it all somehow works within a system. So it'll be interesting to see your kids growing up. Yeah.
Well, and I think, as far as what you're talking about is being polite and stuff, I think that we have it so ingrained within us, and I think that we've come a long way. We just still have a long way to go. So in the 70s, they did a lot of assertiveness training for women, where they were trying, empowering women and making them feel, like they're assertive, they can do these things themselves. And in these groups that they ran, the women got a lot better. They became so assertive. They were really, doing the things they could do. And then they'd go outside of the group and they would be shunned.
Yeah, they'd be called a bitch and go to square one, right?
Right, because the culture wasn't ready for them to be assertive, But again, going back to assertion rather than aggression.
Yeah.
Because I think that if you're like, okay, well, if I'm assertive, that means that I'm respecting you and myself at the same time. And it means that you can have a differing opinion, and I can still disagree with it. I don't have to take your opinion. I just have to respect you have your own. And similarly, I won't allow you to disrespect my opinion because it's my own. It just means we might not see things eye to eye.
Yeah.
And so I think that, if you look at that assertiveness rather than aggressiveness, I think we can get a lot further.
Yeah.
But I agree. I think that it's it's so ingrained in culture, and there's so many parts that are things that are I'm blind to so much of it, and I tend to think of myself as a pretty decent guy, but I still know that I'm blind to a lot of the stuff that happens, and I feel at least secure enough in myself that I can be taught that I'm wrong in certain ways, or I'm not seeing it the way that it actually is, and I'm aware of those things, and I hope that more both males and females can have that kind of confidence where they're like, yeah, I can understand how I'm wrong. I can understand how this could be different and be okay with it.
Yeah, I think that there are difficulties because as a man, you will never experience what it's like to be a woman, and that doesn't mean that you're wrong for being blind to it. The way that you don't be an asshole, basically, is that you're like, I believe that you are having the experience you're telling me you're having.
Right.
I believe that that's happening. So I think that that's also something in sport, that because women tend to be so outnumbered, I get a lot of people who, when I write something that's kind of open about how I cry a lot in training, or like that I felt a certain way, I get a lot of women who are like, oh my god, I thought I was the only one. And it's because there are like two women in a gym, and maybe the other one you don't like that much. So you don't talk to each other. And so this kind of realization that there's nothing wrong with you to be different from the other people around you, or that men just don't talk about the fact that they go cry in the bathroom also, is like it's, I think, a huge part of the mentality is giving yourself permission to identify those things, in addition to just being able to identify those things. It's not a weakness.
Yeah. And it's like this has been kind of a theme that's kind of woven itself into this entire kind of interview, is that it's learning so much about yourself. And sport can teach you more about yourself than anything else. And so I think that it's, like you said, being comfortable with yourself, being willing to admit that, that is part of me. And I don't necessarily have to change it. It can be completely, for me, and I love the term normal, it can be normal for me. And that doesn't mean it has to be normal for everybody. It's just like, no, I accept that that's okay.
Yeah. All right, one more question, just because I'm curious. Who's your favorite comic book hero now?
I still think that as far as the ideals and for what he stands for, it's still got to be Superman. I just think that there's so many ways to interpret him and what he does and everything, but I just think that perception of having the strength and the ability to do whatever it is you want to do, but having the right mindset where you're trying to do the greater good, and I think that just, to me, is just so awe-inspiring. I think that, Batman, I've always been a huge fan of him, and I think that looking at it from his mentality too, where it's like, well, right, you can be righteous and try and do the right thing, but sometimes you just have to kick some ass. And I think that that's also very, very true, but I think that I lean more towards Superman and just think that, just trying to do the best you can do, knowing that it's never going to be enough, and it's
Yeah.
never going to be, you're never going to win over, you're never going to live in a world where everybody is Superman. Not everybody is going to have the ideals you have, but that doesn't mean you have to beat your ideals into them like Batman does. It means that, well, I'm just going to do the best I can do, and I'm going to see where it takes me. I think that, that's kind of where I'm looking at it.
Yeah, Batman's self-talk isn't so good. All right, well, thank you very much, John. This has been an awesome part 2 to our interview from forever ago, and I really, really appreciate that I'm not a jerk anymore and can actually talk to you about this stuff instead of just being like, I don't understand mental training. So thanks for being patient while your little sister caught up. And,
No, it's been awesome watching you, Sylvie. It's been, I really think that I've learned so much through you too. Like I honestly have, because of your ability to have the insight and the awareness within yourself to see these things, and then the honesty with yourself to tell yourself where you're moving. You're a rare person, and I really enjoy working with you. And it teaches me a lot of things that I probably just like you probably should have realized a year ago, and just talking to you, there are things that are just kind of now moving in my head where I'm like, okay, this is going to help me working with somebody else because of knowing this, with the way you've shared parts of you. So thank you very much. I've very much enjoyed it.
it's because we look so damn much the same, John.